And it's another time. It's another episode of Not Playing Politics with Alexander Keaton and Nick Bradshaw. Nick, how have you been?
I'm doing well, brother. How are you hanging in there?
So far, so good, man. Although I think Seattle could say differently.
Yeah, there is evidence to suggest.
Yeah. No, this is 2020 has been wild for a lot of different reasons. But it does seem like, as I've kind of curled through history, someone had said something a while back about how it was weird that you had the Spanish flu about 100 years, almost exactly 100 years ago, and it's like that's interesting. And then all of this is coming around. I'm like, well, hold on, when did it's you go back? It's like the 1919, 1920 time frame was also very, very wild. So I think we're in. And not just for the U.S., for really around the world. So I'm starting to think that maybe there's this 100 year. It seems like we're on a 100 year cycle here, and we're getting everything again, just slightly differently. But this has been a weird year, to say the least.
It's funny. I've gotten to the point that I don't even look at things that long. In conversations with many of my friends, there's a fatigue to it. I had a friend of mine write to me, and she said, this concept of quarantine fatigue based off of an article, and it is. And what's funny is it blurs all the days together. I by no means do I think this is unique to me at all. I think I have a lot of friends and family out there feeling the same thing. But I don't really measure things in terms of years anymore. I kind of measure it in terms of days to hours because it just seems like there's a velocity of information and a velocity of events due to the extensive coverage that's now provided. I mean, we've got hundreds of millions of cell phones that have cameras that have things all over the world. And obviously, we'll get into it here in a minute with the show, but, some of the biggest events that are ever captured are captured on a cell phone. And I'm not just talking about George Floyd. I remember one of the introductions of what citizen journalism meant with regard to a cell phone was the Miracle on the Hudson, when Captain Sullenberger landed the aircraft on the Hudson. I mean, it was captured by someone just standing by. So it's an interesting time. I had another friend mention it. He said, 2020 is the lost year. And I'm choosing not to see it that way because I want to think about it as the year of the Phoenix. I don't mean that as a pun with regard to actual things burning, but I simply mean it that I think that this has given us a chance maybe to recalibrate a little and look at some of those things that maybe we took for granted before. I know I did. I certainly did.
No, I think that's a valid point. It really is. But I like the idea of it being, hey, this is, from a personal standpoint, I think a lot of this is shaking, right? The whole point was, I think we've been shaken to a core to really sort of see what's there, right? It's like how do you get wheat from the you have to sort it, you have to shake it, you let the chaff blow away, and the kernels actually remain. I think that's what's happening this year, right? This has been a time period of sifting. And I don't want to lose sight.
If nothing else, we could,
because it's introspective. Right?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I mean, we could definitely shift this show from one of current event and politics to one of farming. I mean, that's a channel that I think is not tapped into yet. But no, I think you're absolutely right. I think it comes down to the simple fact that there's the word I would use is recalibration. Recalibration for what we're doing in our day to day. Recalibration what we're doing in our jobs, with our friends, with our families. But it's also kind of highlighted things in us that I think are kind of quite beautiful. And I know some of my friends out there are probably rolling their eyes going, all right, silver lining, Dave, let's take a breath. But, what I'm trying to think of is, hey, these are waking us up to a lot of the stuff we weren't capable to think about before. And even through all of this chaos, we have an environment that demonstrates to us how we are capable of adapting. We can literally adapt to anything. I mean, it's amazing. And I think that, by utilizing, social media and different technologies, that's helped, as best it can. Nothing substitutes being able to spend time with loved ones, but I miss my family and friends like crazy. But, I have become a master of the living room, a la Jerry Maguire, where it comes to Zoom meetings. Thank you. So, it's an interesting world. It's an interesting world for sure.
Well, in Jerry Maguire seems to have been coming up a lot over the last couple of days. So here's the thing, right? And I think the idea of this sort of sifting through what matters and what doesn't, it is also happening kind of with conversations, right? So I think there's sort of two problems that I see here, which is, as far as how this year's gone, there's what's really happening, and then there's how the media presents it. I don't want to talk too much about how the media presents it per se, because that's what everyone else in the world does. But I think it is something we need to remember, that there's how people are perceiving this COVID and the riots and the protests, which are two very different things. Even how we're presented with this is entirely is controlled by different sets of media, and they are pitching very different views of the world. It's very telling by what people will and will not pay attention to, what people will and will not say about certain issues, right? Like what's happening in Seattle. If you're not going to find a lot of information about that on ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN. And the stuff you do here is very much slanted towards what, like, the mayor of Seattle was saying when she said, "Oh, it's more like a block party." It's like,
yeah. I mean, your perspective. I'm going to Star Wars here for my friends out there. One in particular. Your perspective determines your reality, right? And so you're looking at this through the lens of what matters to you. I think what we've done is we found a way to the buzz phrase is confirmation bias, and looking at things from what's called a framing theory perspective. As I've said with many of my friends in conversations, the media can't tell you what to think, but it can certainly push you in a direction with regard to what to think about. And for our fans out there listening right now, I've made them fans, to our loyal, literally tens of fans listening now, I think the conversation is more about what is important to you and how is it being presented. The thing I find interesting about what we're seeing in Seattle is that to me, it seems like what came to the Central Texas area years ago with the Occupy movement. It's become more weaponized and more on the fringe. And it doesn't surprise me that it is in a city like Seattle, Portland, or the Pacific Northwest, with regard to other events that took place up there there were certain colleges and universities years ago dealing with these very same issues in the geographical area. I think that the concern that comes to my mind, and we're going to kind of just jump into it right now. The concern that comes to my mind, as I said before, is the velocity with which these stories are being presented. And you go through something, and the cause now is something that, we'll take something like Dr. King, who built a movement and built the foundations of a moral and a civil and a social and a political movement. It became a spiritual identity for us to address things that needed correction without question. But now it seems like things move with such velocity and magnitude that you almost can't keep up. And it's this exhaustion, like I've talked about, this fatigue, where it goes from, this tragic death to the addressing of that socially, to protests to go against it, to this potential subversion turning into riots and loss of communities and even more loss of life, which makes it even more tragic. But then shifts to, well, who are these bad faith players? And then, well, who's driving it? And then all of a sudden it's, well, now we're going to push it from police brutality is bad, which nobody should question. And I mean police officers. And I very proudly come from a family with multiple people in law enforcement, and I have several friends in law enforcement, and I couldn't be more proud of who they are. But no one questions, especially those frontline officers, that brutality needs to be addressed at all levels, at every single level, in the church, in our businesses, in medicine, in teaching, in the military, in law enforcement, in day-to-day government, in day-to-day engagements with our friends. But what I'm getting at is that it seemed like what Dr. King took to build over years, or Gandhi took to build over years, has been crammed into a news cycle of, unfortunate death, protest, riot, burning, people in Seattle, guns, Antifa, move on. And it's like, wow. And now the narrative, you can already start to see the narrative spinning back. And this is where you see the media shifting its attention to where it'll think it'll draw the most attention, is you're already seeing it spin back now to COVID, which just 3 days ago was so far off our radar, and now it's back.
Yeah.
And I think that's that. I know for me personally, I never think to speak for anyone else, but for me personally, I need a glass of water.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the whole thing, right? It's like I want to be very clear, there are two different things happening here, right? There is the concern, the protest, the honest brokers who want to have a conversation about police brutality, race in general in the country, and I think that is a legitimate conversation to have. I think there's far more to it than even the media will allow us to talk about. But then there is this other side. There are these groups like Antifa and others who have decided to utilize this as an opportunity to push an entirely different political agenda. And I think that's, for me, that's both disturbing and perhaps the most disheartening, because there was something starting to happen that was beneficial and positive, and then they've, in many ways, these violent protesters who clearly don't care actually about what was happening, they've come in to subvert it and basically say, well, we're here to create our own version. It is very much like the Bolshevik Revolution, again, about 100 years ago, right? It's a political movement that's manipulating and co-opting a legitimate issue.
I mean, I think for me, the concern becomes, for those that know the old saying, a candle that burns at both ends burns so brightly, but for so short a time. It's something that, again, how do you focus your energy on 4 or 5 different things going in different directions, especially when a lot of the messaging starts to get conflated and then it starts to conflict. You know what I mean? Like you're in our attempt, I think I'll speak for me. I'm very big on trying to draw patterns and connections between things. I like to see where one thing links into another. I'd be willing to bet that anyone listening to the show right now has probably had a time or two, my friends tease and we call it having a talk of death. Like it's one of those 2 a.m. coffee shop talks you had in college that you definitely knew that you were curing cancer. I mean, it was the greatest thing that had ever happened in the history of the world. Thank goodness that you and your friend with you at the time were born, because society was all the better. And you were like, yes, we're getting there. Who knows what you were talking about? You could have been talking about your favorite color. But the point is, we try to draw these connections and we try to draw these patterns that we see. And the concern that I see with some of the things going on regarding the movements is, as you said, one of the most American traditions is the concept of protest. Ask 18th century England how that worked out. I mean, like, I have in my heart a very deep sense of respect for those who stand up and say something is wrong and here's my petition. And I love that we live in a country that can do that. However, for those that believe in nothing and just want to see things destroyed, they can co-opt that. They can subvert it. They can undermine it. And they can shift the narrative. And it doesn't have to be a lot of people. It doesn't have to be 90% of the people are Antifa. I don't believe that. I don't think that's even accurate. I don't think that's remotely accurate. I think that there are many people with good intention in their heart wanting to draw attention to a conversation that needs to be had. However, sometimes the squeaky wheel is what gets the attention, because the squeaky wheel is burning a building to the ground. Now, where I struggle, and the example I want to provide, because I tend to think in more anecdotal example, but for me, where I struggle is when you see people tearing down statues of Abraham Lincoln or statues that were gifts in recognition of African Americans who served in World War I or World War II or the Civil War or whatever, that are a reminder, that are a teacher. You know, Condoleezza Rice was once cited as saying, and I'm not talking about statues of like Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln. I'm talking about statues of Civil War generals and whatnot, that she made a comment once about statues are designed in many ways that can teach us all types of things in all types of directions. Like, look at what there is. I heard a comment that there are those who believe that Auschwitz, which represents the embodiment of evil on this planet, should never be torn down, because it is that reminder of look where man can go. And I think that when you try to have a conversation, the most dangerous part is that it's not being met in good faith with people that want to have that conversation many times, and not from the protest side, but from the subversion, from the subversion. And that's dangerous. You can't have a conversation with someone who just wants to burn things. You can't have a conversation with someone who doesn't, and here's the most dangerous part of all of this, who has had their sense of history stripped away from them. When you desecrate the statue of Winston Churchill on D-Day, you have no concept of what's happening. When you desecrate the statue of Abraham Lincoln, also known as the Great Emancipator, you have no sense of your own history. And I feel such frustration that people have had that taken from them, that they don't know what has been lost. That to me is the great loss.
Well, so here's the thing, right? It's not like this hasn't happened before. Like I said, if you want to talk about themes, this has all happened before. The destruction of history, the cleansing of history to remake it and reshape it is literally the very first step every totalitarian state takes, whether it's Maoist China or the Russian Revolution or the Nazis. It's all Cuba. That first step of rewriting history, of removing the idea of being able to look clearly at history and say, okay, what was the good, what was the bad, is important. And I think the reason it's so important here is if you understand history, you can see what Western civilization and America specifically has tried to do. You go back 2,000, forget even going that. There was a professor who was once asked, I forget who it was. He was asked, when did slavery start? His response was, that's the wrong question. The question is, when was the idea of freedom first thought of? Because the history of humanity is one long contiguous story of oppression and tyranny and the struggle to become free. If you lose that perspective that what we are doing and what this entire country was predicated on was the idea of trying to pull away and get away from these things, these old ways of doing things, to become more free, to become more inclusive, to become more diverse. If you lose that perspective, if all you see is all the ways in which we failed to live up to an ideal, then you lose what everyone else has gone before you, and you end up destroying and defacing statues of people who were abolitionists. It's like, I'm sorry, what was it that they did? What was their great sin that they had to be destroyed and defaced? This was someone who, these were people who were abolitionists who tried and worked and tried to make the world a better place. But it's the first step towards this, and really we see it with what's going on in Seattle. It's this first step towards a totalitarian state. It's always the emotions are manipulated by those who have very deep, very evil leanings it's like, we want to create this perfect society. It's this utopian society. I forget the news reporter. I had it, and I've completely forgot the guy's name. His quote, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, is that the desire to save humanity is almost always a cover for wanting to rule them. And let's take a moment to look at Chaz. And there are, don't get me wrong, there's elements that are funny. We will absolutely laugh at this. but we do need to take it very, very seriously. So for
I
those
mean,
who are unaware,
the fact that it's named after somebody that sounds like they work as a cabana boy at a summer club. I mean, that
exactly
alone is the best part. I mean, you know what I mean? It's like they didn't pick something like the Free States of America. It was something like, what's the name of your town? Kevin. Wow. All right. Well,
yeah.
I mean,
Okay, that's the
yeah,
thing.
I mean, and the reason, and here's the concern I have with that. If I can just jump in real quickly.
Yeah.
The concept, I actually presented based off work done by a fellow professor in graduate school. I made a presentation with regard to reframing the refocusing of our current events, and I did it through image manipulation. And it showed how certain pictures were done in certain ways. And it's funny, you mentioned someone like Mao and someone like Lenin, and you're right. But what's really creative is that if you go through certain places in Rome, you can see where Emperor Nero, used to have people's faces carved off the side of buildings.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because the first thing that you do to install yourself in a role of government or leadership is remove any image or idolatry of those before you. The first victim of any war is history, right? Or fact or truth. You can look at it in any way that you want to present it. But what I'm getting at is that I think that with regard to what's going up in Seattle is that it feels like a more organized, for lack of a better word, weaponized version of what OWS was, and Occupy Wall Street. And it's I say this without trying to make it sound dismissive, but it's hard to take it seriously because they're not going through the channels to be taken seriously. They're going, and it seems like that the response, which is what has really made it's not the people that have struck to make this commune. That doesn't surprise me. It's the response that seems to have come from the area of, no, I'm good, it's cool. Like, what's stopping me from just going downtown right now and being like, all right, everything north of the river is mine because, well, I wanna. And that was what was interesting to me, was to see the response of the installed government at the time to just pack up and like head out. That was very, very striking to me.
So let's take a step back here and assume that people don't necessarily know everything that's going on with Chaz. So just as a quick sum up, Chaz stands for Capitol Hill, which is the area. It's the 6-block radius in Seattle. It's the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. So what's happened is a group of radicals basically have walled off this sort of this 6-block radius and basically are claiming it to be their own. They have set up they actually have a sign that says you are leaving the United States. They are calling it an autonomous zone. Now, how it fell is open for some debate. Of course, if you listen to the police chief and the people who speak for the police, they said they were told to leave by again those up in the by the mayor basically. But that's sort of secondary to my point. So essentially, it was taken over, and what has happened is they've created these impromptu walls. And they have taken over the police substation that was there that's servicing these areas. Anyone who comes in and out, they're being frisked. Their ID is being checked. They've looted all of the food that's in the area now they're asking for people to send them soy-based, meatless, vegan replacements. They've also asked for oats and fruits and vegetables. Basically, sunglasses. They've asked for everything that they would need. Basically, they're like, we can't do this on our own because you took up the middle of the city. You don't have farms. You don't have anything to actually supply yourself with. And if you're not allowing food in, to stock the businesses, they are also asking for, or they're basically just jacking people for money. It's basically everything you would expect to have happened or to happen within a area has been taken over by radicals. Now, the interesting thing is how the news media is going out of its way to not show you what's happening. The people in the autonomous zone have actually kicked out people who are recording things, right? They've kicked out the news media. They don't want people to see what's really happening there, particularly after what appears to be. He doesn't seem to have the same level of control as some people are claiming that he has, but apparently a rapper has sort of taken over as sort of this warlord. He doesn't have the same degree of control because there's just a bunch of different people with different ideas. But there, he is on film looking at someone's who was defacing property, and he's like, "No, you don't get to do that on this property." And he's quoted as saying, very specifically, he says this on the film. He says, "I'm the police now. Because there's no police, I'm the police now. And if I catch you doing this again, I'll shoot you." So the obvious. People have been talking about the obvious ironies and hypocrisy of the whole situation, right? And I don't want to focus too much on it because I think there's a bigger point here, which is the same people who literally last year were saying, voter ID is wrong, stop and frisk is of the devil, walls only separate people, and walls are immoral, are doing everything that they claimed they believed was evil. And yet, as easy as that would be to mock, and don't get me wrong, the fact that they need soy-based vegan meat substitutes is beyond funny. The simple fact of the matter is, it does underline sort of the political aspect of this whole thing, which is it's not hypocrisy; it's the fact they never believed it in the first place.
Well, I need to jump in on something that's very serious right now, and that is to say this for anyone listening out there knows this about me. Even if I were in lockstep agreement with every single decision made from within Chaz, if I couldn't get cereal at least 3 times a day, I just wouldn't be able to survive. And I would be like, "Sorry guys, I'm out. I need some Cookie Crisp." No,
that's why you wouldn't have joined Chaz, because you would have known, you thought ahead. You would be like, "Wait, there's not going to be any Cookie Crisp here."
Yeah, exactly. I mean, come on, people. Life is about choices. No, but what I'm getting at is, so again, from that point, you mentioned something that speaks to me. Again, for people that know me out there, like, I'm a process guy. I want to talk about the policy. I want to talk about, I don't want to talk about, well, this person did this. Oh yeah, well, this person did this. Like, that doesn't go anywhere. That just breeds people deeper into their own hole. But the concern that I'm seeing is you've got the mayor now who is at loggerheads over the conversation with what to do with her own state, with her own Seattle police chief. So there's a breakdown in the process. And that's the part that I'm trying to keep drawing us back to. I'm not surprised that people, excuse me, living here in Austin, you could see people at the city capitol years ago for the OWS movement, and they were just kind of left there for a couple weeks. And then one day the city came through and just kind of like hosed off the whole place, and like everybody went away. And I wonder if it's one of those things where it's like, we've had people locked up for months, and maybe this is a social science experiment for these people to kind of just do their thing. Now, the other side of it is going to be, for my friends out there, I want to address 2 things. Number one, when we use the term radicals, I think we need to be careful. Not that it doesn't sound dismissive because we're trying to be mean or something. Like, oh, that, watch your PC. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it doesn't sound inaccurate. It just sounds lacking. We are very much aware of what kind of mentality is present there. It's so Antifa, meaning anti-fascist, which is ironic because they use fascist tactics, but you've got anti-cap, which are anti-capitalists, right? So you have a socialist-based, anti-capitalist kind of migratory groups that shift and move. Like, you've got people that are from the area and from surrounding areas. You've got environments of people that tend to be usually very highly educated, but were very underemployed. I saw an article once that Antifa became the hotbed for all of the kids that weren't capable of landing high-paying tech jobs. They came out of college with $180,000 in debt, and they went into under what they felt were under-recognized, developing underprivileged jobs from where they felt they should have been. And I think before we just say radical, the ideas are way out there, but we know who's there. You're looking at your hardcore left wing, in many ways, socialist perspective. Also, those who again, I think there were a lot of people now that are just kind of starting to go check it out, like street festivals. Those who occupy it and live there and want to do what they want to do, there's different mentalities. But I do think that novelty element is there, and people are like, hey, let's go check it out. I want to take a quick moment to throw in a quick anecdote from a friend of mine from years ago, and they talked about the trucker cap. And it was based on a story, I think, that came from Rolling Stone magazine years ago. And it said, the evolution of the trucker cap. Yeah. And for those who remember, trucker caps, of course, from the 70s and 80s were, think Smokey and the Bandit, the big fuzzy front, got the foamy front with the mesh back. And it was popularized by a lot of truck drivers that would wear them. And it was from companies that were, poultry companies and shipping companies and gas companies. But as we entered the early 2000s, the late 90s and early 2000s, it became kind of the benchmark fashion statement of every rock star out there. Excuse me. And the gist of it became that this element of clothing, this trucker cap, represented that once it was embraced by the zeitgeist and it was popularized by these artists, what happened was you started seeing trucker caps at the mall. You started seeing trucker caps on figurines at the Gap. And when that happened, everything that had made the trucker cap unique and popular in the first place had been homogenized and had been corporatized, and therefore it lost its zeal. And within like a year or two, it was gone again, and it had gone back down underground. I want to use that loosely, very loosely, as a representation of watching how some of the beliefs that you're seeing with these people popularizing now, beyond that of a trucker cap, but they're moving to a posture where something that was kind of always there, again, doesn't surprise me that we're looking at the Pacific Northwest, Portland, Seattle, in that area. Schools, Evergreen State University, for our listeners out there, check out some information on Brett Weinstein and Evergreen State University. You'll be able to see some similar movements to what's happening now. But the point that I'm getting at is, in the same way that those things have been popularized, you've now got the hardcore believers that are driving this force. They're that internal, epoche. They're that inner driving core going behind it. But the novelty of those people coming on the street to come check it out. Hey, we can finally get out of the house. Hey, it's Saturday. What do you want to go do? I don't know. Let's go check out that Chaz thing. I mean, if I would be interested. So that's something to consider. And as it becomes more mainstream and as it becomes more popularized, it's funny. It doesn't become more adopted and adapted as much as I think it just becomes more dismissible. Oh, okay, cool. Well, that was kind of weird. I don't really want to do that anymore. And we'll see what happens in the way that Occupy Wall Street did the same thing. So I'm interested to see what happens from a process point. How does the state police chief, how does the mayor, how do the people get back into touch? Because the flip side of this coin is going to be, is this the testing ground for everyone that ever said that socialism works on a small scale? I mean, they have every resource they need. They have 6 blocks of one of the major cities in the United States. They have enough people to sustain it, and it could be a petri dish to really trying out this whole concept.
Oh, and in fact, it's sort of in a broader sense, I'm actually for that. I think that we kind of need to say, hey, we need to have cities or maybe an entire state say we want to go full whatever. Let them do it. Like, that's the entire point of federalism is that we can have these experiments. The problem is we don't have honest brokers in the media really sort of telling people, hey, this is what's really happening in Chazistan. They need to work on that. Let's help them shop. We need to help them shop that out. So for Chazistan over there, it's like the media is trying to hide what's actually happening, which is why they're pivoting back to COVID, right? Because you're right, people are going to check it out. The problem is a lot of jump them all is the term radical because they're not. I mean, literally in the legitimate or in the actual historical sense, someone who's willing to take up arms to do this, and that's what's happening. But you're right. There's a lot of different factors in here, which is why they're having a lot of trouble. Actually, there's footage of them trying to have this sort of debate as to where they go and how they do things, and it's utter chaos. But the fact is, the thing that's sort of unifying them is this idea that they need to destroy what already exists. There's no, we need to work within the system, or let's revise the system. Let's find where the problems are and fix the system. It's, we need to destroy everything, burn it down, and start over. Well, the problem is, what does it replace this with? See, and I think this is one of those things that people really miss, because again, we've, as easy as it is to point to right now and say, look at what they're doing with the statues, look at what they're doing with this, look at how they're trying to wipe away history, with, you know, HBO banning, you know, removing, you know, Gone with the Wind. This happened 100 years ago. And what I mean by that is, we allowed history to stop being taught in schools. We teach social studies. We have these very revised, very limited, you know, lessons on what history actually is. There's so much that's missing. People, I mean, if you were to ask most people today, can you list the things that were written in the Declaration of Independence that were listed as grievances to the king? I guarantee you, if you were to stop 1,000 people on the street, not one of them could say anything beyond taxation without representation. Like, that's it. That's the only thing that people get. Like, but there were 95 things, and taxation without representation was way, way low on that list. They wouldn't understand.
There are those who would say that our founding fathers had 95 problems, and taxation was one.
Exactly. Well, and so that's the thing, right? Is like they lost the. In fact, here's the thing that people kept talking about was, well, look at, you know, people keep my friends who were left leaning were always saying, well, look at the Tea Party, or at the Boston Tea Party. Yeah, let's actually look at that. How did the framers and the founders actually think about it? They opposed it. When it happened, a lot of the founding fathers said this was wrong because it was the destruction of private property, and they paid restitution to the India Tea Company. Why? Because they said that it was wrong. That was not a proper response. They had pamphlets and writings and articles. They explained everything that they were doing. The founding of our nation is this very long, multi-year process of having a conversation of what it is that we need to replace the rule of King George with. That was the whole point. We haven't had that conversation. What we're having is what happened 100 years ago in Russia, or in Maoist China, where it's like, we need to, you know, look at this inequity. We need to burn everything down and then ask questions later.
Well, I think we have to look at it again. I mean, the buzzword that we always use on this show is context, right? I mean, I think, and I want to choose my words carefully, not because I'm ashamed or afraid to use them, but because I mean them in a very specific manner. The reason that we look at some of the things that we see now is that I think that there's probably, if you were to speak to Joe Schmo on the street, and certainly in speaking to some of my friends, I've been able to get kind of a feel, and that is that what has happened. And I'm not speaking with regard to the protest. I'm speaking more with regard to this Capitol Hill, is that it's not to be taken seriously because these aren't serious people. They have a decentralized, loose confederate of membership based off of a decentralized leadership platform. Well, that can't sustain. You know, when you're not willing to come together and unify and provide a coherent, unified message, you get, we are not one, we are many. Well, that's great. I can't get my friends to agree on a restaurant to go to dinner, let alone a governing platform for a survivability of a self-sustaining society. And I think that what you see, if you look at social, I don't want this to get too huge, I'm just simply saying socialism by study within the context of an economic model requires a limitless revenue source to sustain it. That's why the biggest example you always get from people is, well, socialism can work on a small scale. I mean, sure, if that small scale is your family, but that's because there is already a source of revenue being generated because usually someone in that family is working. The point that I'm getting at is that when you see this model of what's going on in Seattle, it's not sustainable. They ran out of food within the first 24 hours. There's already going to be a separation of ideas. They're already starting to cancel culture, if you will, some of the leaders because they're finding that they had evidently sexist and racist tweets and posts that they had put up before. A friend of mine once said, the hardest, and I mean, he's a progressive Democrat and very proud of it, liberal, and I embrace having conversations with all of my friends, regardless of our political views. In fact, you know, let's get those conversations going. They're valuable with everybody. But his words, not mine. He was like, it's just so darn hard to know how to pass all the purity tests because they're always changing, and no one ever knows what they are. No one can ever possibly pass them, and that's why you and I were speaking offline about the most dangerous thing that I see in terms of communication is that we have entered a realm where you cannot apologize anymore. And apologies are tremendously valuable. When any of us have had friends apologize, or we've made apologies to friends, when you really mean it and it's in your heart, it's a tremendously powerful communication tool. It's a tremendously important element of contrition and an element of growth, right? Humility and bonding. I mean, many friendships that we have are usually made stronger through an apology. But what I'm getting at is that we live in an era where it's like, if you just put one thing up, you can almost start the stopwatch of like, and they're going to pull that down in 3, 2, 1. I'm so sorry that I wasn't mindful of what it is that I was doing. And what I'm getting at is that's because we also live in an era that we have to put everything in the world out in public all the time, constantly, for this reaffirmation. I don't know why that necessarily is there. I have a great many friends that I would never see having to apologize for something, because what it is that they're saying and doing, if you know their heart and know who they are as a person, there's nothing for them to apologize with. But I think what's fascinating about what's going on in our conversation now is that it's no longer about accepting somebody who's different. It's not about accepting a belief structure that you don't agree with. It has nothing to do with acceptance or tolerance anymore. It has to do with alignment, agreement, and contribution. It's not good enough for you to have a different opinion anymore. If you have a different opinion, it's because you're wrong. And therefore, it is morally imperative that I remove that opinion of yours, or I cancel it, or I delete it, or I shame you into taking it down. So what you can do now, the only act that I've seen, is that the mob, when they come for you, they're going to come for you nonetheless. So all you can do is stand your ground. Now, if you've put up something you believe in, I'm talking in the realm of social media, then you're going to defend it. And that's fine. But it causes us to do that. I'll switch gears real quickly. For my friends that follow my Facebook page, I put up a post recently in what I thought was just, I mean, the marker of where we are in 2020. And there are stories coming out. I never heard of this show, Paw Patrol, until recently. I'd met somebody who has a son, and her little boy is very into this show. And I started to hear about it, and I'm like, oh, that's neat. I mean, they're all emergency responders and first responders and law enforcement and military. And I was like, this is great. So what a phenomenal show. Well, evidently the cancel culture has come for this show because it is just intolerant that we would in any way endorse that one of the characters, named Chase, is a police dog. I'm not making this up. And of all people, to come to the defense of this with very highly charged rhetoric. I actually I tamed the way that I wrote mine based off a different story, but there's other stories out there where you can see the language that this person used. And when I say this person, I'm not talking about a parent from a YMCA. I'm talking about a founding member of NWA and gangster rap icon Ice Cube, coming out in defense and using more colorful language than I'll use on this channel of a children's animated show. I mean, my friend, welcome to 2020. And that's when I say that I wanted to articulate this point when I said it before. They're not to be taken seriously. This is not being engaged by those that we were so profoundly impacted when Dr. King said to live in a time when my children shall be judged and men shall be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. We're talking about animated dogs. How does one conflate that? And to hear the narrative that Antifa represents the storming of the beaches at Normandy. I mean, it's been, the waters have been so tainted that we've gotten to the point now that the only solution left is to not talk about it. And that is how you divide a country. I don't believe that America can be overtaken through a kinetic energy. I don't believe that America can be overtaken through military action. But I believe, like any great power, Rome, England, the Dutch, the French, whatever, the Aztec, whatever, like any superior power in the world, it will decay from within. So what you do is you break down the ideals of what it means to be American. You go after things like the national anthem or the American flag. You take down the sense of identity of what it means and what those beliefs stand for. That's the danger.
So I want to go back to Paw Patrol for 2 seconds, because I think that is
I bet that was a sentence you never thought you would say.
in my life, I never thought.
And you're a parent, for crying out loud.
So yeah, my kids missed Paw Patrol, thankfully. But they had other things. That my youngest was there for Umizoomi. That was just the worst thing I've ever seen. It teaches kids math, and I'm like, this is the most annoying thing I've seen ever in my life. But let's go back to Paw Patrol.
Mr. Rogers, can we just take 2 seconds to recognize, the beauty of the Muppets and Mr. Rogers and Kermit the Frog, and I'm just saying, talk about sneaking under the wire for some great cultural input as a child. We hit the jackpot.
Yeah. Oh, we did. No, we did, which is why we're awesome. But so here's the thing. Like Paw Patrol is exactly what you're talking about, right? Why can't Chase, who was a police dog, be on there? Well, because what it does is it teaches kids that police are good, and that they are helpers. It doesn't make them the villain. This is what you do. You the reason you have to destroy history is not that so you can properly judge it, but it is to control it. It is to say anyone who thinks a particular way is evil. This is exactly what George Orwell was talking about. In many ways, if you put 1984 and Aldous Huxley's A Brave New World together, you have what's happening right now. But I want to point out, Thomas Sowell, I think, said it best. He said that they, meaning people like Antifa, like these others, so they want villains to hate and heroes to cheer, and they don't want explanations that fail to give them that. And I want to follow that with another of his quotes, which is the reason so many people misunderstand so many issues factual or analytical explanation that leaves them emotionally unsatisfied. And that's really where a lot of this is coming from, right? The unrest is not coming from people who've thought about the situation and say, okay, there's a problem here, let's fix it. What it is, it's an emotional response. It is very much like what happened in France, right, with the French Revolution, where by the time you're done, what you have is a bunch of burned down cities and a bunch of headless aristocrats, and then everything. You get the beauty of Napoleon, right? And we all know how wonderful that was. That's the thing. These are not people for whom numbers or facts matter. It's what they feel like, and what they want is the hero. They want to, because for them it is morality. It is the hero is always right, the villain is always wrong, and if I'm right, I'm the hero. Then anyone who disagrees with me is inherently evil. That's what we're playing with here. That's who these people are. That's who's taken over and created Chazistan. That's who's breaking into targets and setting small businesses on fire. These are the people who are shooting indiscriminately and killing minorities. That's who these people are. They don't actually have. They've never thought any of this through. They don't have a plan. They have emotions, and what they want is heroes and villains, because that's the easy way. facing history, learning how to deal with issues, learning how to walk through things is difficult. And more importantly, it's humbling. And pride is a huge driver here. Mark my words. That's because they can't possibly be wrong. They can't, I guarantee you, these people have never once said, am I wrong? Because they've never contemplated it, because they don't want to contemplate it, because that's difficult. They want the easy way out. And by the way, they're not the only ones. I would argue, again, this entire channel is dedicated to the idea that we, for the last really 50 years, as a almost post-World War II, have only played at politics. We haven't actually done it. Because to do politics is hard. Politics is supposed to be the way we, people of differing ideas, differing agendas, differing belief systems, come together and actually live our lives. It's how we decide how to make decisions that's best for everyone. That's what politics is supposed to be. But instead, it's become a contact sport. And the problem is, when politics is a contact sport, then those who are disaffected by the regimes, by the decisions that the politicians make, they also become full contact. And that's what this is. So while it does sound dismissive to call them radicals and to say that these people are not people who've thought things through, that is true, and it is slightly dismissive. But it is also not to say that they exist in a situation that has caused pain and struggle and turmoil and strife. And so the problem is, you have people who are experiencing real problems, like graduating from college with $100,000 in debt and having a degree that's worth nothing, that has no real skill.
Right. And to the point that it's again, my intent is to identify with a title, not just reduce to, well, look, you can produce the title radical in either direction, right? And that's why I say don't lean into the title of radical, simply because it seems reduction. It seems simple. I call it what it is. It's an anti-cap, anarcho-socialist movement. That's what it is. I mean, that's the title of what you're looking at. That's what you're watching. To speak about two influential speakers, two influential narratives that I think are driven by those who would create the strategy behind them, I would say would be Joseph Goebbels and Saul Alinsky. From that perspective. Now, Joseph Goebbels, of course, was the main propaganda minister under the Third Reich, who very much, and I'm paraphrasing, very much created the context of the phrase, and this goes out to all of my friends in the public relations realm out there. If you tell a lie frequently enough, loudly enough to enough people, lie can become the truth. And the flip side of it is that Alinsky had something very similar, and what his was is that if you push a negative hard and deep enough, it will break through into its counter side. The other point that he's known for, Alinsky, which is the book Rules for Radicals, was something that has been championed through a lot of these movements in the late 20th century, early 21st century, anarcho-socialist movements. And one of them is the very famous phrase, whoever's ever read any of his literature knows, and it's Rule 13 and of his 13 rules. And it's, you pick the target, you freeze it, you personalize it, and you polarize it. Now, the best example of that I can think of right now is when you look at like the statues. What you do is you personalize it. Or for example, when people would say things like, the wall is racist. Well, that's personification. There's nothing real about that, but it's a personalization of something. And then you polarize it. If you endorse that, because the wall itself is racist, if you now endorse a wall, you are therefore a racist. And that draws on the concept of, if you make everything an ad hominem attack, if everything you say is based off of the concept of identity, then then it doesn't matter what you think, it matters what you are. And that's the exact opposite of what I think America is founded upon. I think America, the best way I ever had it put was from my uncle. And he said, America is not a destination, it's a belief. It's an idea. The concept that the color of your skin does not determine how successful you will be or the opportunities that you shall have. Now, major caveat to that. There are people out there that are wildly racist who will make those issues a very big thing. who will not hire you at certain jobs, who will not let you into certain clubs, who will not give you certain rights or privileges or speak to you with respect. I mean, that goes without saying. That's kind of sixth grade, junior high social studies perspective. But when you look at an institution, whether it's the church, education, the military, medicine, business, what have you, in this country, through law, I mean, canonized in edict, you are not to be judged upon by that. Now, man is flawed, and therefore that it's not going to just go away instantly, because we will never form a utopia. But the point that I'm getting at is whether or not you run into that perspective of that kind of ignorance with regard to racism. The structure is such that it should not be that way, and that's why when you look at something like Chaz, I'm sorry, it just sounds so ridiculous to say that. It is not something that is designed. It will and cannot be sustained. It has to be fueled by outside sources. Now, you may see that you're seeing companies like YouTube and Microsoft that are funneling money into things. That can help them. But the individual engine that they have cannot survive. And it won't. If left to itself, I had somebody say to me recently, and I thought this was really old school, because this is actually a tactic utilized by Julius Caesar on Vix Generis. And what he did was, Caesar was actually attacking a position, and the enemy had a heightened position. They were at the high ground. So Caesar fought a two-front war, and he literally dug a trench around where they were and fought on two sides, and then just starved them out.
Yeah.
And literally just had to wait. And the person that I was speaking with, I said, they said, well, what do you think the solutions are to this, and what do you want to do? And their recommendation was, they were like, nothing. Just set up have 6 blocks, set up a perimeter that's 7 blocks wide, surround them, and just cut off all communication and food. And I thought, geez, I mean, that's kind of dark. Like, I don't think anyone is looking to hurt and more pain. Again, violence, I don't see as the cure for violence. That, death doesn't justify just more death randomly. I think you need to look at the perspective. What can we do to generate good conversation, to change the narrative, to change the thought process behind it?
Yeah.
And so, again, I want to end on what I started with, which is, if you look at the tactics that are utilized, I think many of these people, it's almost like, to your point about 1984, it's a removal of this broken mentality that, you're dealing with a country in the United States that outlawed through law slavery 140 years ago, and is in a place where there is law and criminality about slavery going on in the world right now. Try to be a Uyghur Muslim in China right now. Look at Israel. Israel is the only multi-ethnic, multi-religious state in the Middle East. I mean, try to look at what you have that's present. You're looking at an environment that you've got people that really believe. And here's what you're seeing. If you push that negative narrative long enough, deep enough, it will break through. And that's what you're seeing. I mean, that's why Antifa went from looking at, the Obama administration, recognizing them as domestic terrorists, or at least this conversation is being presented at that time, to them now being presented of people comparing them to storming the beaches of Normandy. I mean, that's something that's interesting. And now we have a weapon in the socialized media platforms of computer systems that are interconnected across the world to drive that at a velocity that's just unmatched, which brings us back to our initial point, which might be the death of it by itself, because we're already moving on.
Well, again, I think you're right on that. The only thing I would add to it, though, is it can't just whimper and die. There needs to be actual conversation. Again, I'm going to go back to where we started this whole thing.
I think it needs to be shown that it doesn't work. It needs to be expressed that it doesn't work. And I think it will. I mean, they ran out of food in 24 hours. But
the thing is, it's not enough. It has to be seen. And that's the problem, is we have, again,
you're talking about contouring, how the narrative is being contoured.
Exactly. The narrative is being contoured, is being by a media that absolutely agrees with them. I think that's
by stakeholders.
Yeah, exactly. is if we don't have an actual people looking at this saying what is happening, let's really explore this, and then we'll have learned nothing, and it will have been for naught. And that's my fear. So that's why things like this are important, so we can actually talk about it. That's why the new media is important. Is that the old media is no longer something that we can trust. And let me end on that, on an idea that Plato came up with, 2,400 years ago, right? In his allegory of the cave. It's it's famous. To sum up though, you have a couple but some people chained in a cave and they know nothing of the outside world. All they can see is this back wall of the cave. Well, the light behind them, right, is shining on that wall. So anything that passes between the light and them gets has a shadow cast on the wall, and for them the only thing that they see of reality are those shadows. Now, where he was intending it for knowledge and the idea that that's what we're trying to figure out, right? He points out that if one of the men were to become free and see what things really were, he would no longer be able to communicate with the people in the cave. Well, I think in many ways we're very much living that, because our entire reality is dependent on what we get to see in media. We don't know anything that doesn't occur within it and isn't shown to us. And so because we aren't there personally to see it. And so the problem is this is why the divide has become so great. The reason when we try to have discussions and they get nowhere is because we're using two different languages. We have two different contexts for everything. We have two different viewpoints. And so unless people are actually seeing what's happening in Chazistan, we're just going to keep having these things happen over and over and over. They're not going to see, this is a bad idea. Here's why. Here's what they're really trying to do, and usurp what is, as we've said multiple times, and I will continue to say multiple times, is a good conversation that we're actually starting to have. I'm in Dallas just a few days ago. The president was here and he had a roundtable discussion with leaders in the community and Black leadership in Dallas and several other people. And it was a really interesting roundtable. The front page of the Dallas Morning News the next day wasn't president sits down with Black leadership to discuss issues. It was Trump calls for crackdown. That was the headline. Now, in context, you would understand that he actually meant crackdown on a number of things, right? There was conversations of starting a database for bad, to see if we can track bad cops, finding ways to get rid of, for bad cops to be fired faster. For example, the gentleman who killed Mr. Floyd had 18 complaints against him. Like, there was a problem there, but it's very difficult. I have friends in the police department who will tell you it's hard to get rid of a bad cop. So there were things that were talked about, but if you only got the Dallas Morning News, or if you only got the national media's viewpoint of it, you didn't hear the conversation that was actually had. What you were presented with, here's Trump just being whatever it is story that you're actually trying to hear. Because I actually listened to what he said, but I also listened to what everyone else said at the table. I was listening to the whole thing live. And it was two very different things. So
the initial impact is also, remember that you've got 47 people that are actually reading the newspaper in Dallas, because distributions of actual hard papers are virtually nothing. Maybe they're getting it online. That's fine. Again, if it's about framing a narrative, again, that when news outlets became monetized through channels that were owned by corporations, the perspectives of those news channels then became based off of the larger good. Everybody's got a boss. And at the end of the day, when you see that, we live in the clickbait era. We live in the like era, and therefore you've got to draw people to your page. And the way that you do that is when you have headlines that say things like, "Can your tap water kill you? Tune in at 10." Oh my gosh, I've got to tune in.
I have tap water.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I have tap water. And to my friends out there, I think we all know how I would react. Let's be honest. I will hold myself accountable. I would drive to Portugal to get water. But what I'm getting at is, I don't mean that in a reductive way. I simply mean, are there narratives being crafted? Of course. We've seen this we've seen it. And I think at the end of the day, though, the struggle that it comes about are the outlets recognizing and treating the readership with the integrity, capability, and desire to serve them as an audience? Or has everybody in the digital age just become op-ed? I personally think that having worked in mass communication, having taught and been in that realm as well, I disagree with the concept that there's a 24-hour news cycle. And it's the story example that I always use. Quick side note. The story that I always use is the first time I really remember coming in contact with that feeling of this is not news. This is entertainment, which is the whole infotainment model, was when Anna Nicole Smith died and they had parked a news helicopter over her house.
Yeah.
He was ashamed that this young woman had died. I believe it was for a drug overdose. And it was a shame. But that needed to be privatized with her family and whatever they needed to go through. And it could have come out in the news. Okay. But parking a helicopter outside of her house and just having it hover, and then having to hear from her junior high best friend, lunch mate's roommate about what she like, that's not news. It's just a production value given to a story that doesn't have much of what's called an evergreen feeling. Like it's not going to last long. But to your point, if the concept is there are narratives being influenced by these institutions, sure. And I think everybody out there is aware of that. And I think that's why we all go to where we want to reinforce that media dependency theory, right? We all want to go to where the narrative is going to reinforce what we already think. I'm willing to bet that I know where a lot of the people at Chaz probably utilize news sources. I would be surprised if there was a massive Breitbart readership in Seattle. I would be surprised if Alabama was being flooded with members wanting more stories from the slate. It's just what it is, right? You can see what it is, but that perspective is going to be reinforced. And it feels good, right? You read a story and it's like chances of enter whatever narrative you want seems slim. Oh my gosh, great. The danger is now we as readers aren't looking to our outlets to provide us with professional service with regard to information management and distribution. You have to read 5 different stories from 3 different websites to get the whole story if you just want to find out the who, what, where, why, when. And that linear model that you talked about with regard to sitting down and watching Dan Rather at 6 o'clock, that's gone. And I don't think it's gone necessarily because of the trust. I'm not arguing that point with you. Go ahead. I'm sure there are people that don't trust it. But they're not doing it anymore because it doesn't linearly tie into their model with time. They can get news anywhere, day or night. Why would they wait to sit down at a certain time and watch commercials about local Ford dealerships when they don't have to? They can just stream it on their phone and they can look at 100 news sites through an aggregate like Google. The problem is that I don't know how many people, when they're looking at those sites, know how many of those websites are already contoured. Now, I would say that we are part of a generation and of a group, and certainly those after us, that understand how to contour those things and how to craft different stories in there. But if you get the default settings on a lot of aggregate news readers, you're going to see the same 5 major media outlets that you'd see anywhere else because they've got the revenue to cover themselves on those platforms.
Right.
That was my nerdy fact of the day.
Well, here's the thing. I completely agree with you, although I have one pushback, is I do believe that the vast majority of people in this nation don't understand that the news media is absolutely changing and manipulating what they're seeing. I think they do take it legitimately or seriously. I think they say, nope, this is what happened. Because I don't think you get the polls. I don't think you get a lot of these things that we see. In fact, I'll go one step further. I don't think you get the problems in our society that we have if the news media was being treated the way they should be treated. Meaning, if people looked at the news media and said, hey, I don't buy that because this doesn't seem to fit what I'm actually seeing in the real world. Oh, hey, it's because it's being manipulated. I don't think that's what's happening. I think that's what's actually causing so much of the problem is that people they really do literally they take it for verbatim. They take it as a real explanation and example of what the world is going through. So I think that again, which is why I do believe that that's our biggest problem, is that we don't have an honest broker in mass media right now, and it's just not happening. And that's causing these divisions. The changes in language. Recently, again, beyond the conversations I've had with other friends of mine, Rush Limbaugh had a conversation with Charlemagne the God and the other people on the Breakfast Club. And if you kind of take a step back and just listen to how they're talking, like forget about the content itself, it's kind of obvious they're talking two very different languages. They are using the same words, but they clearly have two different definitions. And the reason there was no matching up was because their view. No, it wasn't just they disagreed on issues. Their views on the issues were entirely different because they were coming at it from different media sources. They had different contexts for things, and it's because, like you said, odds are if you're in Alabama, you're not probably reading a lot of Slate. In the same way, if you're in Chazistan, you're probably not saying what's on Breitbart or what does Fox think about this, right? It's like that's not where you're going, and that's the problem because now we can't talk to one another, and if we can't talk to one another, then there is no pathway forward at all.
Which is why I think you and I wanted to have this channel going, because I think that in our lives, we have been benefit and blessed by having friends and family members in our life we can have these talks with. And what I've seen is that many of them are educated and highly aware, maybe not from a global production level of, what's going on. But, I trust that people can be, the truth just sounds differently. And I think that for a lot of us, you read stuff and you're like, okay. I mean, again, you're looking at viewership each night on some of these cable news shows of what, 1.5 million. That means that for every 300 people in America, one of them is watching one of these shows. I don't even know 300 people. I don't even know where I could go to find 300 people. So what I'm getting at is, as much as we may be seeing them, I think that those that do track and follow this, such as yourself and me, this is something that we see as this instrument. I think that the country and our friend group, I'm only going off of that. I think that as we've said on this show so many times before, what's important is your kids getting into a good school, or maybe making a little extra money to help pay off the mortgage faster, or making sure that your health coverage is where it wants to be. It's not, does GE still own NBC, and therefore the company that sells you their light bulbs is now going to push you narratives on this. I mean, at the end of the day, you can tell. I don't care whether it's left, right, straight, center. It doesn't matter. When you watch someone on TV, you get that vibe, you get that feel, and it's just, as a human, I think we're built with that intuition. You just have that feeling of what's going on. The question is, can you have those debates and engage those conversations? And the problem is, with so many facts coming out so quickly all the time on different channels, it's hard for people that are working to raise their family, to pay for their vacation, or to buy their wife a beautiful piece of jewelry, or to buy their husband a beautiful new guitar, or to go on a trip together, or whatever. Like that, that's where I see this coming. That's why I think this show for us has been important. For us, not as many people are listening right now. I don't think we've mentioned the word Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, Republican, Democrat, and until now, an hour and 12 minutes in, because that's not the focus of what we want to do. Like you said so clearly at the beginning, everybody does that. We're trying to cut through that and say, what are we seeing and feeling out there, especially in this bizarre time, where now ratings on most of these shows are going to be higher than they ever are because of the fact that there's nowhere else to go. I think as we get back out to work, back into our lives, we're going to see a natural, regression towards the middle. But I do think that it is important that we keep those lines of dialogue, and most importantly, that we keep the capacity. And this is something I will say to every one of our listeners out there that I substantially need to work on every day. And that is that we all focus on being better listeners, because that's the part that I think is getting squashed. It's just, well, wait for me to say a fact that I know because I found something, and here you go. And that is something that I sincerely want to dedicate myself to getting better to. And my friends have been boundlessly patient in that realm, and it is from that perspective that I think we could all do a lot better.
No, I completely agree, and I think that for me, as someone who grew up in sales, in a lot of ways, the key phrase for me as for what you're saying is listen to understand, don't listen to reply. But that's what we do now. We listen to reply. We don't actually listen to understand the other person, the other person's perspective, the other person's history. it's sort of like the meme, that floats around and pops up in my feed at least once a month, which is people don't want to hear your opinion; they want to hear their opinion coming out of your mouth.
Huh.
And
I don't get memes like that. I just mostly get a hamster on a piano, or like cat hanging from a string that says, "Is it Friday yet?"
Yeah. Well,
I think we follow very different groups.
Yeah. But I mean, that's the fact, right? Is that we are, as a culture, we're no longer trying to understand each other. We're just trying to win, and that's a problem because we're back to now. Let me plug the name of the channel. Now we're back to just playing politics. We're not actually trying to do politics. We're not actually trying to make the world a better place. We're just trying to dominate the other side, and that's not healthy. That is not how progress actually happens. So,
sorry,
I think
you lost me with the whole "it's not about winning" thing. Like, no, sorry, nope, not with you.
Well, but that's the whole point, right? Is how do you define winning? I would define winning in this context as creating a better world for everyone with the most practical solutions.
For me, getting a gold trophy and going to a pizza party after the game. No, I know what you mean.
That works too. I mean, there's nothing wrong.
I have a dear friend out there. Hopefully she's listening, but we used to always laugh that you can follow certain outlets. And honest to goodness, if I read one more story that starts, or that the lead is something like this, so-and-so crushes somebody else. And it's like, really? Like, did Ben Bernanke crush the Fed? Is that like, you know what I mean? It's like Mother Teresa crushes her opposition. First off, the woman was 4 feet tall. What did she crush other than like a Muppet? Like, but
I'll be honest.
It's exactly
going down that hard.
It's exactly the perspective you're talking about. You know what I mean? So and so has this blow up in their face. Like, why are we celebrating that? Like, that's half of, for me, the value of this channel is the hope that, I'll be honest, a lot of times it's the hope that those out there listening know that I'm listening to them. Because a lot of the input and a lot of the thoughts that I have and I see expressed on our shows are conversations that I recall having with some of my friends. And I realize that those conversations are taking place. You know what? In the halls of our homes and in the seats of our cars when we used to go places together, but whatever, in the conversations that we're having, those topics are there. We are discussing them. And I don't want us to lose that lens, to lose that focus, that just because MSNBC or Fox or CNN or whatever might be telling us that we're all separated, we're so different, I still believe the things that bring us together are much stronger. And that's why when I see something like the American flag or the national anthem or bowing for prayer or standing for what it is that I believe, that's why those things are important. Not because I'm ever trying to oppress others into believing them, but because I live in a place that it's free for me to express them. And I'm eternally grateful for those who have gone to sacrifice that, because it is their sacrifice. It is their willingness to give up so that others may have. And I just don't want to lose that. And I think that for a lot of the people out there having the conversations right now, I think that those conversations are important and they are being had. And that regardless of what happens with Chaz or anywhere else, as long as we keep those ears open and those hearts open, I think we can get there. I really do. At a friend's point about 2020 being a lost year, I teased with him about it. I was like, no, I think 2020 is going to be the year of the Phoenix. I think it's the year that we're going to rise from the ashes and we're going to come out stronger and recalibrated.
I don't disagree. Well, let me rephrase this.
Also, a lot more pale in my case. Very pale.
yeah, you are looking a little pale. Let me just say one thing though on that, and then we can move on with the rest of our lives. I think you're right. I do think that the conversations that need to happen need to be between people, and they need to be about facts. But they also we need to be listening to understand. And I think that we could be the year of the Phoenix if we make it the year of the Phoenix. I think we have to stop. Again, we have to stop playing politics. We have to actually do it. We have to get out and talk to our neighbors. We have to have these conversations and say what's important, what's not important, what is of real value. Because if we're not having those conversations, then it's irrelevant anyway. So again, I like your optimism. I think we can. I think this can be the year of the Phoenix, but we have to make it so. Until then, everyone, this is Alexander Keaton and Nick Bradshaw signing off. Nick, do you have any? Say goodbye to the nice people.
Stay safe, everybody. Much love. Bye-bye.
Bye.